Evelyn Nesbit embodied the contradictions of the Gilded Age, an intoxicating beauty whose rise as a model and chorus girl concealed a life shaped by manipulation, betrayal, and tragedy. With copper curls and an ethereal allure, she captivated high society. But beneath the admiration lay a harrowing entanglement with two men who would determine her fate. Stanford White, the celebrated architect who shaped New York's skyline, introduced her to luxury yet preyed on her youth and vulnerability. Harry K. Thaw, a volatile millionaire, saw her as both a prize and a weapon in his vendetta against White. Their bitter rivalry exploded into a shocking murder at Madison Square Garden, igniting a trial that captivated the nation and turned Evelyn into a cultural obsession. The case exposed the hypocrisy of power. Men like White wielded influence unchecked, while women like Evelyn were scrutinized and discarded. Pushed into the spotlight by an ambitious mother and controlled by Thaw's domineering matriarch, she became the tragic centerpiece of a moral reckoning. Was she a victim or a schemer? This is the story of Evelyn Nesbit, a tale of beauty, power, lust, and betrayal. She lived more in her first 21 years than most do in a lifetime, and spent the rest of her days contending with a legend not of her making. Florence Evelyn Nesbit was born on Christmas Day, either in 1884 or 1885, in Tarentum, Pennsylvania, to attorney Winfield Scott Nesbit and his wife, Evelyn Florence Mackenzie, of Scottish-Irish ancestry. Evelyn had an especially close bond with her father, who nurtured her curiosity and confidence. He encouraged her love of reading, setting up a small library filled with fairy tales, mythology, and adventure stories, often those marketed toward boys. When she showed an interest in music and dance, he supported her ambitions, fostering dreams beyond the constraints of her time. But her idyllic childhood was short-lived. When Evelyn was around 10, her father died suddenly at the age of 40, leaving the family penniless. Their home was seized, their possessions auctioned off to pay debts, and their once secure world crumbled. Evelyn, her mother, and her younger brother, Howard, moved into a series of cramped boarding houses, surviving on charity and meager earnings. Her mother, unable to sustain them with her dressmaking skills, struggled to find steady work. Desperate, she attempted to run a boarding house of her own, enlisting young Evelyn to collect rent from transient men. The venture quickly failed. Evelyn later recalled the distressing task. Mama was always worried about the rent. It was too hard a thing for her to actually ask for every week, and it never went smoothly. In 1898, in search of better opportunities, the Nesbits relocated to Philadelphia. Evelyn and Howard were temporarily placed with relatives while their mother secured work, not as a seamstress but as a sales clerk at Wanamaker's department store. Soon, both 14-year-old Evelyn and 12-year-old Howard were put to work at Wanamaker's, enduring grueling 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. Their wages barely covered essentials, and Howard's health continued to deteriorate, forcing him to be sent away yet again. Then, Evelyn's fate took an unexpected turn. A chance encounter with a passing photographer led to her first portrait, the beginning of a new path. Later, while working at Wanamaker's, she was approached by an artist, Mrs. Darrach, who asked her to pose for a portrait. Her mother, cautious but desperate for income, agreed, especially after confirming the artist was a woman. Evelyn sat for 5 hours and earned $1, an amount that, despite its modesty, sparked the realization that modeling could provide an escape from poverty. Word of Evelyn's beauty spread quickly among Philadelphia's artistic circles. She became a sought-after muse for illustrators, portrait painters, and stained glass artisans. Her ethereal presence transformed her into an angelic figure in church windows and advertising illustrations alike. The work was grueling, long hours of stillness, little rest, and growing isolation, but it paid far better than Wanamaker's. When I saw I could earn more money posing as an artist's model than I could at Wanamaker's, she later said, I gave my mother no peace until she permitted me to pose for a livelihood. Evelyn's image soon became a sensation. Magazines described her as a paradox, both childlike and mature. By 15, her age was already debated, her beauty turning her into a commodity, her mother quitting work to manage her rising career. Evelyn, caught between survival and self-preservation, had taken her first steps toward the world that would both elevate and consume her. In June 1900, Mrs. Nesbit, convinced Evelyn could earn more in New York, left for Manhattan alone, using her daughter's savings. Months later, having achieved nothing, she summoned Evelyn and Howard to join her, considering Macy's as a fallback if modeling failed. The city proved unforgiving, with a brutal winter and dwindling funds forcing Mrs. Nesbit to finally seek help. Painter James Carroll Beckwith, captivated by Evelyn's beauty, provided contacts, ensuring she avoided exploitative work. Evelyn quickly became a sought-after model, posing for celebrated painters like Frederick S. Church and Carl Blenner. With cascading auburn hair and a wistful gaze, her ethereal beauty captivated New York's art world. The press took notice, dubbing her the Little Sphinx, comparing her to Venus and Cleopatra. Her mother, despite mismanaging their earnings, controlled Evelyn's career while fretting over the industry's propriety. To skirt child labor laws, she routinely inflated Evelyn's age as America itself wrestled with the contradictions of Victorian morality, condemning open discussions of sexuality while exalting youthful beauty. As photography replaced illustration, Evelyn's face became ubiquitous, gracing advertisements, postcards, and magazines. Top photographers, including Joel Feder, declared her the pinnacle of beauty, earning her up to $18 a week, an immense sum compared to her days at Wanamaker's. By late 1901, she was America's first true pinup girl, selling everything from Coca-Cola to cigars. Yet despite her fame, she remained directionless, controlled by those who profited from her image. Longing for something beyond modeling, Evelyn set her sights on the theater. At 16, she announced, "I am going to be an actress." When Broadway producer John C. Fisher deemed her too young for Florodora, her beauty and determination won him over. Cast as a chorus girl, she took on the name Evelyn Nesbit, stepping into a world of illusion. Though moralists scrutinized the stage, she later insisted that the real dangers for young women lay elsewhere. Shielded from adult conversations, she was, for now, still seen as an innocent, though the world around her had other plans. Evelyn admired the resilience of chorus girls, recognizing that their performances to attract male attention mirrored society's expectations of all women. She relished the stage's excitement and the allure of Broadway nightlife, frequenting rectors where glamour and mischief intertwined. Though her mother disapproved of her late nights, her concerns focused more on preserving Evelyn's beauty than safeguarding her innocence. By September 1901, still a Florodora chorus girl, Evelyn had drawn the attention of powerful admirers. One evening, veteran performer Nell King invited her to a fateful society luncheon hosted by Stanford White. Born in 1853 in New York City, Stanford White was the son of Richard Grant White, a Shakespearean scholar and dandy with deep ties to the city's art world. Growing up surrounded by influential figures like John Lafarge, Louis Comfort Tiffany, and Frederick Law Olmsted, White developed an early passion for design. Despite having no formal architectural training, he apprenticed under Henry Hobson Richardson, one of America's most celebrated architects, refining his skills in the grand, Romanesque revival style. By the late 19th century, White had become one of the most prolific architects of his day, co-founding the prestigious firm McKim, Mead, and White. His work reshaped New York's skyline, blending European elegance with American ambition. Among his most famous designs were the Washington Square Arch, the Villard Houses, the New York Herald Building, and the second Madison Square Garden, crowned with a scandalous nude statue of Diana, which became a beacon of controversy. Beyond architecture, White was a fixture of Gilded Age high society, known for his charisma, extravagant lifestyle, and patronage of the arts. But his refined public image concealed a darker side. His private world was one of indulgence, secrecy, and a relentless pursuit of young women. It was this pattern that led him, in 1901, to a fateful introduction to Evelyn Nesbit, the teenage chorus girl whose beauty would captivate him, and whose connection to him would seal his fate. Expecting a grand hotel, Evelyn was surprised when they arrived at an unassuming building above an F.A.O. Schwartz toy shop. Inside, White's apartment dazzled with velvet drapes, antique furniture, and a hidden lit atmosphere reminiscent of the Arabian Nights. At 46, he struck her as terribly old, but his extravagant hospitality quickly won her over. After a lavish meal, he introduced her to a red velvet swing, delighting in her childlike enthusiasm as she playfully kicked at a parasol. Before she left, he arranged for a dentist to fix a minor flaw in her tooth, an apparent kindness that, in hindsight, revealed his calculated attentiveness. White soon sought out Mrs. Nesbit, presenting himself as a benevolent patron eager to assist Evelyn's career. Enchanted by his warmth and influence, she welcomed his attention, even as Evelyn's wealthy suitor James Garland warned against him, calling him a voluptuary. But White's charm proved irresistible. Unlike the men who merely sent flowers and notes, he fascinated Evelyn with intellect and wit, drawing her deeper into his world. He lavished her with elegant gowns, fruit baskets, and an exquisitely designed suite at the Wellington Hotel, complete with an ivory bed draped in Irish lace. One evening, White gifted Evelyn a striking red cloak and feathered boa, instructing her to wear them for a special party. Her mother eagerly sewed a new dress, unaware of White's growing hold over their lives. That night, as Evelyn stepped into a carriage, he emerged from the shadows with a playful wink. When she asked him where they were going, he simply said, "To my garden." At Madison Square Garden's tower, White unveiled his private sanctuary, a lavish retreat of velvet drapes, Tiffany sconces, and an ebony piano draped with a paisley shawl. A decadent feast awaited, surrounded by exotic bird of paradise flowers. Laughing at her red cloak, he called her Little Red Riding Hood, enchanted by the image. Insisting she be photographed in the outfit, he arranged for a trusted photographer. Evelyn, unaware of the deeper significance, agreed, further cementing herself as White's latest obsession. White assured Mrs. Nesbit the session required her approval, knowing her chief concern was payment. As Evelyn balanced childhood fantasy with the intoxicating pull of luxury, she remained blind to how deeply she was slipping into his control. White skillfully balanced affection and authority, making Evelyn feel cherished while deepening her dependence. Unlike her other admirers, he positioned himself as a protector, introducing her to literature and high culture while subtly dictating her choices. He ensured her safety at night, often more invested in her well-being than even her mother. Over time, his influence expanded, securing Howard's education, providing financial stability, and drawing both Evelyn and Mrs. Nesbit further under his control. Those familiar with White's habits saw the pattern. Photographer Gertrude Casimir sensed the danger when he commissioned an intimate portrait of Evelyn, capturing her innocence tinged with uncertainty. As his control tightened, he persuaded Mrs. Nesbit to visit Pittsburgh, leaving Evelyn in his care. Before departing, she made Evelyn promise to see no one but White. Days later, he arranged an elaborate photo shoot, culminating in an image of her draped in a Japanese kimono on a white polar bear rug, a haunting prelude to what was to come. White's seduction followed a precise script, culminating in a night that would alter Evelyn's life forever. He led her to a hidden bedroom, unveiling its grand canopied bed framed by beveled mirrors. With the push of a button, tiny bulbs bathed the space in shifting amber, rose, and blue hues. The scene was theatrical, surreal, an intoxicating trap she never saw closing around her. Wrapped in a silk kimono, warmed by champagne, she remained unaware of what was to come. Evelyn hesitated at the bitterness of the drink, but obeyed, recalling White's insistence on acquiring refined tastes. A strange buzzing filled her ears. Her head pounded, the room spun. Then blackness. She awoke wrapped in violet silk sheets, disoriented, barely registering White's sleeping form beside her. Then she looked down. A streak of red on her thigh. The flimsy pink undergarment clinging to her skin. Panic seized her. She screamed. White bolted upright, pleading with her to stop. Confusion and terror overwhelmed her as she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirrored ceiling, her reflection multiplying endlessly. She dissolved into tears. White dressed hurriedly, wrapping himself in a red satin robe, then draped the embroidered kimono over her shoulders. Stroking her hair, he whispered reassurances. "Don't cry, kittens," he murmured. "It's all over. Now you belong to me." Mechanically, Evelyn dressed, her hands clumsy, her mind blank. White arranged for her to be driven home. She sat by the window in the early morning light, numb and hollow. "I felt nothing," she later wrote. Neither repulsion nor hate. She searched for an explanation, something from novels, backstage gossip, whispered warnings, but found nothing. Her head ached, her body throbbed. This is what people made such a fuss about, she thought. This, then, was what love meant. Years later, when skeptics questioned how a chorus girl could have remained innocent until that night, she simply replied, "There is an innocence which finds for evident evil an innocent explanation." White had controlled everything, the trust, the timing, the moment. Only later did she recognize his patience, his calculated kindness. As dawn broke, curled up in the carriage, she understood. The man she had seen as her protector, her father figure, was something else entirely. He was a generously big man and infinitely mean. He was kind and tender, and preyed upon the defenseless. And finally, the words that captured his truth. He was a benevolent vampire. White's control over Evelyn deepened as he wove indulgence with authority, dictating her choices while ensuring her dependence. He charmed Mrs. Nesbit with his generosity, securing Howard's education and positioning himself as their benefactor. For Evelyn, he was both protector and captor, molding her into his vision of perfection. Their world was one of excess. He arranged lavish photo shoots, capturing her in luxurious kimonos and intimate portraits meant for his private collection. At his infamous tower, he delighted in watching her swing high above the room, shattering paper parasols with her feet. For her 17th birthday, he transformed the space into a winter wonderland of roses and holly, showering her with fox furs, diamonds, and pearls. She affectionately called him Stanny Claus. But beneath the spectacle, she began to recognize his love as possession, not devotion. Evelyn's fame grew with roles in The Wild Rose, A Chinese Honeymoon, and Under Two Flags, her beauty celebrated in newspapers and theater magazines. Yet she began to chafe under White's control. He had a pattern, collecting vulnerable, fatherless girls, shaping their lives, then moving on. Watching him lavish attention on others, she sought escape, flirting with racket club suitors like Bobby Collier and Monty Waterbury. White, amused, remained confident in his hold over her. Then she met Jack Barrymore. Unlike White, the 21-year-old actor could take her out in public, offering laughter instead of luxury. Their whirlwind romance filled gossip columns, but Jack, constantly borrowing money, was no match for White's influence. When Evelyn spent the night at Jack's apartment, though he gallantly slept on the floor, her mother and White erupted in fury. White interrogated her, desperate to confirm whether she had been intimate with Jack, knowing it would determine whether he kept or discarded her. Jack proposed, but Evelyn, torn between love and financial survival, hesitated. White seized the moment, warning her that madness ran in the Barrymore family. Realizing he had lost, Jack stormed out, leaving Evelyn in White's grasp once more. His response was swift. She was sent to an all-girls school in New Jersey, cut off from Broadway and Jack. As the press speculated about her sudden departure, another figure, long obsessed with her, emerged from the shadows. Harry K. Thaw. For years, Harry K. Thaw had fixated on Stanford White, blaming him for social humiliations and vowing revenge. Seeing Evelyn as both a prize and a weapon, he pursued her under the alias Mr. Monroe, sending letters and cash gifts, which she returned, unaware her mother kept some. When chorus girl Elba Kenny arranged an introduction, Thaw made a theatrical entrance, dropping to his knees to kiss Evelyn's dress. His exaggerated manner unsettled her, especially when he ranted about White's ugliness and his marriage. Dismissing him as a peculiar admirer, she believed she'd never see him again. Thaw, however, refused to be ignored. The next day, he appeared at Evelyn's apartment, revealing his true identity to her mother, who, remembering a past rejection by the Thaw family, remained unimpressed. Soon, Evelyn was seated beside him at a staged dinner, where he dramatically announced, "I am not Mr. Monroe. I am Harry Kendall Thaw of Pittsburgh." Unmoved, Evelyn replied, "Indeed." His grand reveal had failed, but his pursuit had only begun. As heir to a $40 million fortune, Thaw's erratic behavior was infamous, chasing cab drivers with shotguns, throwing extravagant parties, and indulging in sadistic pleasures across Europe. Behind his public displays of morality lurked a predator, known in underground circles as Bathtub Harry, for his violent abuses of young women. Though Evelyn knew none of this, those around her sensed something was off. She rejected his relentless gifts and proposals, returning silk stockings and a Steinway piano, yet he remained undeterred. Isolated from Broadway and still grieving Jack Barrymore, Evelyn began tolerating Thaw's presence, mistaking his persistence for sincerity. When she declined his first marriage proposal, unable to reveal White's role in her past, Thaw retreated to Monte Carlo to plot his next move. Meanwhile, Evelyn's exile at an all-girls school was a disaster. Her past as an artist's model and actress made her infamous. Reporters swarmed, and Jack, heartbroken, drunkenly pinned love poems to trees near campus. White still visited, but his inappropriate remarks unsettled her classmates. In April 1903, Evelyn was struck by severe stomach pain and underwent a crude appendectomy in a classroom. With White unavailable, her mother reluctantly turned to Thaw, who arranged the emergency surgery and knelt beside her as the ether took hold. When she awoke, it was White, not Thaw, at her bedside. Advised to rest for a year, Evelyn saw an escape. Thaw funded a European trip, secretly following on another ship. Before they left, he proposed 3 more times. Each time, she refused, knowing honesty could cost her everything. In London, another blow came. Her hair began falling out, likely from post-surgical opiates. The doctor prescribed a drastic remedy, a full head shave. Weak and sedated with laudanum, she turned away as Thaw's valet sheared off her hair, stripping her of the last remnant of self. Before their departure, White discreetly gave Mrs. Nesbit $500, which she kept hidden from Thaw. But even with that secret fund, they remained trapped between 2 men vying for control. While they were in London, Thaw initially played the devoted gentleman, eager to win Mrs. Nesbit's approval, but his mask soon slipped. One afternoon, he trapped a bellboy, brutally beating him with a riding crop. The scandal was buried with a $5,000 payout, and Evelyn, unaware at the time, would only later learn the full horror. By June, they moved to Paris, where Thaw lavished Evelyn with expensive wigs and extravagant outings. Parisian friends, unaware of her hidden hair loss, affectionately called her Le Bébé. When Evelyn casually mentioned White's secret financial gift, Thaw exploded, seizing the letter of credit and deepening the rift between himself and Mrs. Nesbit. Tensions grew unbearable, and when Mrs. Nesbit demanded to return home, Evelyn, exhausted by the constant conflict, agreed to stay with Thaw if that was what her mother wanted. With Evelyn cut off from her mother, Thaw saw his moment. Moving her into adjoining suites at the Ritz, he declared his love, demanding she marry him. Panicked, Evelyn hesitated, sensing his growing volatility. As he ranted, fists pounding furniture, he pressed for the truth about White. Exhausted, she finally gave in. Against her better judgment, she told him everything. Harry listened in rapt horror. When she finished, he collapsed into a chair, whispering, "Poor child." His body trembled, his breath came in gasps. His grief soon turned to rage. He blamed Mrs. Nesbit, branding her complicit. Evelyn defended her mother, but doubt crept in. Had she failed her? Kneeling before her, Harry swore to be her savior, promising she was blameless. Yet his tormented expression betrayed his true thoughts. White's corruption had forever tainted the woman he idolized. His hatred for White, already festering, now fully consumed him. Back in London, Mrs. Nesbit, furious at being stranded, cabled White for money and accused Thaw of corrupting Evelyn's morals. White, fearing scandal, sent funds, further fueling Thaw's paranoia. In response, he swept Evelyn across Europe, but his obsession with purity darkened. At Joan of Arc's birthplace, he scrawled in the guest book, "She would not have been a virgin if Stanford White had been around." His piercing stares and muttered whispers unsettled Evelyn, but she was trapped. In Innsbruck, Thaw unveiled his latest scheme, a stay at Schloss Katzenstein, an isolated castle in the Tyrol. Expecting a scenic retreat, Evelyn instead found herself in a dark, desolate fortress. Then, without her realizing, he dismissed the staff. One night, she awoke to Thaw bursting into her room, naked and furious. He struck her with a riding crop, then tore her nightgown away and beat her mercilessly. Her screams only fueled his frenzy as he ranted about sin and punishment, blaming White for corrupting her. Pinning her down, he sexually assaulted her. When it was over, he interrogated her. Had White convinced her such things were normal? When she stammered yes, he exploded, raging that decent women like his mother and sisters would never do such things. Then he left, locking the door behind him. For 2 weeks, Evelyn remained confined, covered in welts and bruises. Thaw treated her wounds with stinging ointment, speaking as if nothing had happened. When he finally announced their departure, she understood the truth. Whether planned or opportunistic, he had known he could attack her in complete isolation. In Zurich, she insisted on seeing a doctor. Thaw agreed, but sent one of his own, Dr. Mendes Ernst. The moment she met him, she knew. Like so many others in Thaw's world, he was under his control. There would be no help, no justice, only silence. As their journey dragged on, Thaw's erratic behavior worsened. He recklessly paid off disputes, including 2,000 francs for a carriage accident he insisted wasn't his fault. Thaw's obsession with purity grew increasingly deranged. He insisted on visiting the Jungfrau, the highest peak in the Swiss Alps, its name meaning virgin. In Zurich, Evelyn saw the doctor again, who ignored the lasting effects of Thaw's brutality. Detached, she moved like a shadow, while Thaw, deluded, blamed White for her suffering, refusing to acknowledge his own role. With Evelyn no longer the angelic figure of his fantasies, Thaw could never forget, nor forgive, her past. Their European tour had become a waking nightmare of control, veiled threats, and inescapable dependence. Desperate for relief, Evelyn convinced him to allow her chaperone, Miss Simonton, to rejoin them in Paris. Evelyn found a brief respite at Elizabeth Marbury's Versailles estate, but a casual mention of Stanford White jolted her back to reality. Overwhelmed, she confided in Marbury and Elsie de Wolfe, who quickly arranged for her return to New York. Sensing he had pushed too far but unsure how to fix it, Harry reluctantly funded her travel. Arriving in New York on October 24, 1903, Evelyn immediately struggled, losing half of Harry's money to customs and failing to locate the attorney he had sent. Isolated from her mother and brother, now under White's financial care, she felt trapped in a city still ruled by Stanny. Worse, she began uncovering disturbing truths about Harry, his morphine addiction, history of brutality, and deep instability. White, dismissing Thaw as an unhinged fool, underestimated the real danger he posed. Thaw, receiving frantic telegrams from his lawyer, learned that White and Mrs. Nesbit were preparing legal action. Enraged, he ranted about Mrs. Nesbit's betrayal, fixating on how she had once left Evelyn in White's care. Meanwhile, Evelyn, back in White's orbit, felt herself slipping into old habits. Though she resisted rekindling their affair, fate intervened when White spotted her on Fifth Avenue. Soon after, he called, insisting on an urgent meeting. Fearing bad news about her mother, she agreed. Instead, he confronted her about Thaw. "Don't you know he takes morphine?" White demanded. "You must have nothing more to do with him." Drained, Evelyn wondered why he hadn't warned her earlier. Falling into familiar patterns, she chose the path of least resistance. White secured her an audition for The Girl from Dixie, offering stability she no longer had. Whether his renewed attention stemmed from kindness or a desire to reclaim her before she aged out of his preferred type, she couldn't tell. Overwhelmed by work, abandonment, and relentless warnings about Thaw, Evelyn suffered from insomnia and neuralgia, relying on sleeping powders and painful nerve treatments. Determined to erase Thaw's influence, White played protector once more, boasting that he had brought Mrs. Nesbit home from London to prevent legal trouble for Thaw. He painted Harry as a dangerous addict and warned Evelyn that Thaw's detectives were everywhere. Exhausted, she obeyed, avoiding Thaw for 5 weeks. Meanwhile, her mother detached herself entirely, focusing on her new life with stockbroker Charles Holman. Just before Evelyn's 18th birthday, White summoned her to lawyer Abe Hummel's office, hoping to block Thaw from returning to New York. Hummel recorded her testimony, twisting it into a melodramatic tale of kidnapping and abuse. When she tried to correct him, he dismissed her concerns. He then urged her to file a breach of promise suit against Thaw, a common tactic for actresses. Evelyn, laughing nervously, admitted that if anyone had broken a promise, it was her, not Harry. Hummel, unimpressed, sent her away. White, sensing a looming battle, pressed Evelyn for Thaw's letters. Suspicious, she refused at first, but he insisted they were for her protection. Reluctantly, she handed them over, and Hummel sealed them away as leverage. Evelyn began questioning whether White's concern was genuine or self-serving. Hidden away at the Hotel Navarre, Evelyn was soon found by Thaw's detectives. He called, pleading for a meeting. She agreed, on the condition that she could bring a witness. When he arrived with his lawyer, Thornton Warren, she sat in her steamer trunk, exhausted. "I have heard such dreadful things about you," she confessed. Harry dismissed the accusations as lies from White and Hummel, painting himself as the victim. He admitted to his irregular behavior at the castle, but blamed it on his anguish over White's betrayal. Then he asked, "Did you sign anything?" Evelyn hesitated. "That's funny," Harry mused. "If they want to cause trouble, you must have signed something." Doubt crept in. Weary and overwhelmed, Evelyn began questioning her own memory. Worn down by Harry Thaw's persistence, Evelyn resisted his demand that she leave the girl from Dixie, even when he offered to pay her salary. He countered rumors of his drug use with smug confidence, insisting he had never lied to her, unlike White. His violence, he claimed, had been a moment of madness, never to be repeated. Slowly, Evelyn began to waver. Meanwhile, White's renewed attention felt more like self-preservation than concern, and her mother remained distant. As Thaw intensified his campaign against White, he spun Evelyn's past into a tragic tale, portraying himself as her savior. She agreed to see him again, only in public, but soon he returned to Pittsburgh, where his obsessive instability deepened. During Thanksgiving, he confessed Evelyn's past to his mother, who initially warned him against scandal, but after he broke down in church, she relented, fearing another suicide attempt. With her reluctant blessing, he returned to New York, more determined than ever. By December 1904, tensions between Thaw and White had escalated into a private war. Evelyn, now disillusioned with White's influence, drifted toward Harry. On Christmas Eve, she made a final break, refusing White's invitation to his tower party, and instead dining at Rector's with Thaw. But the night was clouded by Harry's paranoia. When he learned White was still supporting Evelyn's brother, his fury grew. White, too, was unraveling. He allegedly brandished a revolver in a jealous rage, vowing to kill Thaw before sunrise. Desperate for stability, Evelyn convinced herself that Harry's remorse was real. She even handed him letters from White, hoping to end the feud. Instead, it fueled his obsession. For the next year, he curbed his outbursts, proving his devotion by financing another European trip, this time with a proper chaperone. The press speculated, had they married or had she been paid to leave him? Meanwhile, the Thaw family, opposed to the match, insisted Evelyn erase all traces of her past. No acting, no modeling, no reminders of her former life. By early 1905, Evelyn's options had dwindled. White would never leave his wife, her career had stalled, and respectable marriage seemed impossible. Unlike White, Thaw could offer financial security without secrecy. Unlike Barrymore, he could provide stability. Worn down by years of pursuit, she finally relented, choosing, at last, her own captor. On April 5, 1905, Evelyn Nesbit married Harry K. Thaw in a small private ceremony. Dressed in black, she never removed her coat or hat. She moved into Lyndhurst, the Thaw mansion in Pittsburgh, the very house from which her mother had once been turned away. To the world she was now the mistress of millions. In reality, she had simply traded one prison for another. Lyndhurst was cold and oppressive, its heavy velvet drapes blocking out sunlight. Evelyn and Harry occupied separate bedrooms, and his family never accepted her, seeing her as a liability. The rigid Presbyterian atmosphere stifled her, and though she had escaped one domineering mother, she found another in Mother Thaw. Ministers pressed for her redemption, but Harry's own moral failings were ignored. Their hypocrisy became glaring when a reverend violently kicked her dog. Evelyn erupted in profanity, finally speaking her truth in a house of repression. By late 1905, Harry's obsession with White reignited. Convinced White had men following him, he carried a revolver and interrogated Evelyn nightly, forcing her to relive her past, until in a chilling shift, he forbade her from speaking White's name at all, referring to him only as the Beast. His jealousy turned sadistic. He demanded painful dental work to erase every trace of White's influence, subjected her to fits of sobbing rage, and commissioned portraits where she was always dressed in white, his desperate attempt to preserve her purity. In one bizarre act, he staged a photo shoot inspired by Bluebeard, positioning Evelyn's head through a sheet to create the illusion of decapitation. Despite Mother Thaw's efforts to erase Evelyn's past, reminders surfaced. That Christmas, a butcher unwittingly reignited scandal by using an old photo of her on a polar bear rug for a sausage advertisement. In January 1906, a portrait of her displayed at the Carnegie Art Gallery, horrifying Mother Thaw. Evelyn, however, found it all rather amusing. By March, Evelyn welcomed Harry's announcement of a trip to England, relieved that Mother Thaw would sail separately. Their departure was set for June 28th, and in the days leading up to it, they traveled to New York with Harry's friend, Tommy McCaleb. On June 25th, the city sweltered in oppressive heat, sending crowds to Coney Island in search of relief. That evening, Evelyn dressed in a scandalously form-fitting white satin gown, wondering if Harry would approve, so long as he didn't notice her Tiffany hatpin, designed by White's firm. Harry meticulously planned their night, finalizing travel details and stopping at the Whist Club, one of the few places that still tolerated him. But unbeknownst to Evelyn, he was preparing for far more than a voyage. That night, they dined with journalist Truxton Beale, a man infamous for allegedly killing in the name of honor. Harry, fascinated by tales of vengeance, listened intently, his obsession with justice and retribution simmering beneath his polite exterior. Later, at Sherry's, he waited anxiously in a tuxedo with pearl studs, incongruously draped in a black overcoat despite the stifling heat. He downed 3 drinks before Evelyn arrived, his mood taut, his eyes scanning the room. At Café Martin, Evelyn's heart stopped when Stanford White entered with his teenage son and a friend. She kept her expression neutral, fearing Harry's reaction. White had long been reduced to a single name in their world, the Beast. Knowing she had to acknowledge the sighting, she discreetly scribbled a note. The bee was here, but has left. Harry read it, smiled, and ordered more champagne, but as they left, he silently crushed his straw hat in his hands. When Harry announced their next stop, Mam'zelle Champagne at Madison Square Garden, Evelyn's stomach turned. He had always avoided White's domain. Now he was leading them straight to it. On the rooftop theater, Harry refused to check his overcoat, keeping his hands buried in his pockets, an eerie smile fixed on his face. The show dragged on, the audience growing restless. Evelyn tried to ignore her unease until Harry abruptly disappeared behind a potted plant. Moments later, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Stanford White had arrived. Unaware of the looming danger, he took his usual seat, relaxed and chatting with acquaintances. Evelyn barely heard the music as Harry reappeared, jittery and distracted. He hadn't spotted White yet. She leaned in, urging him to leave. He helped her with her wrap, and they moved toward the elevator. Then, Harry vanished. Evelyn scanned the room, panic rising. On stage, a tenor crooned, "I could love a million girls." Across the theater, White leaned back in his chair, at ease. Then, a gunshot. The music faltered. A second shot. A third. Stanford White never saw it coming. 3 bullets struck him, one behind the eye, another through his jaw, and a third in his shoulder. His face, blackened by powder burns, was unrecognizable as he collapsed onto the table, blood pooling around shattered glass. For a moment, the rooftop theater was silent. Then, standing over the body, Harry Thaw raised his pistol and declared, "I did it because he ruined my wife. He had it coming." At first, the stunned audience thought it was part of the show, but as screams erupted, chaos followed. The orchestra hesitated through "I Could Love a Million Girls" before falling silent. A fireman wrestled the gun from Harry, who surrendered without resistance. Evelyn, frozen in horror, gasped, "My God, Harry, what have you done?" He smiled and kissed her cheek. "It's all right, dear. I have probably saved your life." While reporters scrambled to phone in the story, Harry remained eerily calm, waiting for the police. As they rode down the elevator, Evelyn whispered, "Why did you do it?" His response never changed. "It's all right." Then, turning to an officer, he offered money. "Call Andrew Carnegie and tell him I'm in trouble." The officer ignored him. Downstairs, Evelyn was whisked into a car while Harry, still unshackled, casually walked to the Tenderloin precinct. When asked if he knew the man he shot, he hesitated before saying, "Yes." Meanwhile, White's body remained on the rooftop, so disfigured that his own brother-in-law walked past without recognizing him. By morning, the murder dominated headlines. Some papers suggested White had reaped the whirlwind, while others speculated about the motive. Mamselle Champagne became an overnight sensation, drawing morbid audiences eager to see the crime scene. But the real spectacle was just beginning, the media frenzy that would consume the nation. A Madison Square Garden doorman captured the city's sentiment. "We weren't surprised White was shot. We were just surprised it was a husband." A cab driver added, "Everyone always figured it would be a father." Within an hour, reporters swarmed New York, desperate for details. They staked out the Hotel Lorraine in search of Evelyn, the lethal beauty at the center of it all, while others crowded the tombs, awaiting updates on the Playboy killer. Editors scrambled for her image, artists sketched her delicate features, but Evelyn had vanished. At the Tenderloin station, officers cataloged Harry's belongings: a gold watch, $166 in a fine leather wallet, a cigarette case, blank checks, and an empty holster. When asked his name, he bizarrely declared, "John Smith, an 18-year-old student from Philadelphia." The officers, unimpressed, recorded his real age, 28, and dismissed the charade. Unshaken, he sent a policeman to buy cigars, handing over $10 with precise instructions. Refusing to speak without his lawyers, he maintained just enough composure to later argue his sanity. By 2 a.m., journalists tracked down Mrs. Holman in Pennsylvania. Initially in disbelief, she soon broke down in tears. The next day's papers described her as prostrated, insisting she had never met White and claiming Evelyn didn't know him either. But rather than rushing to her daughter's side, she boarded a train to New York, primarily to reunite with her husband, not Evelyn. No family reunion occurred. By 3 a.m., multiple witnesses had identified Harry, and he was officially charged with murder. Escorted across the Bridge of Sighs into the tombs, he dodged the press. Locked in a sweltering cell surrounded by drunken shouts, he imagined hearing young women's voices, one weeping, another crying. Though impossible, he took it as divine approval. Folding his tuxedo jacket under his head, he drifted to sleep, convinced he had freed Evelyn from the beast. By dawn, newspapers flooded the streets, mixing fact with hysteria. The New York Times reported simply, "Thaw murders Stanford White. Shoots him on the Madison Square Garden roof." Other papers ran wild. Harry was drunk, on opium, or provoked at Cafe Martin. Some even suggested Evelyn pulled the trigger. Reports of fainting women and a misprint dubbing Harry's sister the Countess of Vermouth fueled the frenzy. Rumors swirled of a mysterious woman in white and a golden gun, though police found only a rusted .38 revolver. Anthony Comstock seized the moment, revealing Harry had funded his crusade against White for over a year. Oblivious to the consequences, Harry even called Comstock after the inquest, further proving premeditation. As news reached Liverpool, Mary Copley Thaw booked passage immediately, with Alice following. Though later portrayed as a devoted mother, Evelyn knew her as controlling and prone to violent outbursts. Evelyn, dubbed the Girl Houdini for evading reporters, hid with her only true friend, May Mackenzie. For 2 days she barely slept, haunted by the gunshots and relentless media scrutiny. Learning she wouldn't have to testify before the grand jury brought relief, but back at the Hotel Lorraine, exhaustion overtook her. Her mother was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, Harry faced his reckoning. Fixated on why he hadn't secured elite lawyers, his protests ended when he was handcuffed. "We always handcuff murderers," an officer told him. Formally charged, he was sent to Murderers' Row in the Tombs. Despite his incarceration, Harry lived in comfort, dining on Delmonico's steak and squab, washing it down with medicinal champagne. The public was outraged, amused, or both. His lawyers, however, were horrified, scrambling to control him. British papers devoured the scandal. The London Telegraph mocked attempts to frame Harry as a virtuous hero, while the Times condemned his class. Wealth without refinement, luxury without culture. Meanwhile, Thomas Edison's studio cashed in, releasing a Nickelodeon reenactment of the murder that briefly outgrossed the story of Jesus. On July 14th, Mother Thaw arrived in New York, dismayed that Harry's demand for new attorneys had been denied. Convinced his lawyer was conspiring with White's allies, Harry fired him, leaving himself temporarily unrepresented. His refusal to testify at the inquest cost him a key opportunity to plead insanity, a mistake that would haunt him. As the trial loomed, Harry's legal team urged an insanity defense to avoid the electric chair, but he stubbornly refused. Public opinion fractured. Some saw White as a predator, while others defended him as a brilliant but flawed artist. Even his architectural legacy suffered, as critics suggested his indulgences had tainted his work. Then came eerie developments. William Bedford, Harry's valet of 18 years, died suddenly under suspicious circumstances, fueling rumors of a cover-up. Officially blamed on peritonitis, his death led to speculation that he had seen too much. Harry, showing little grief, blamed the district attorney for exhausting Bedford with long interrogations. Soon after, Evelyn's maid, Nellie Leahy, abruptly quit, claiming she felt a chill and ominously declaring, "Someone has walked over my grave." Harry, ever paranoid, believed she had been pressured into leaving. Despite the chaos, Harry remained eerily cheerful in prison, while Evelyn felt increasingly trapped, caught between the Thaw's calculated politeness and the relentless media circus. Every visit to the tombs was carefully staged for reporters, but she grew weary of the charade. When Mother Thaw chastised her for greeting a policeman, Evelyn snapped, "The social position your son now holds is associated with the Tombs prison." The matriarch remained unmoved. Meanwhile, Harry's past resurfaced in Pittsburgh, darkening his reputation from mild degenerate to something far worse. The Thaw mansion was burglarized, likely tipped off by the very headlines the family had fueled. Evelyn, too, faced betrayal. Her brother Howard, devoted to White, cut her off, blaming her for his death, while her mother and stepfather offered no support. Convinced the public was on his side, Harry rejected an insanity plea, furious at being labeled a lunatic rather than a righteous avenger. Some newspapers framed him nobly, but others exposed his reckless indulgences, turning the case into a symbol of America's shifting views on wealth, once revered, now seen as corrupt excess. The trial became a media circus, casting Evelyn as a tragic child bride, White as a predator, and Harry as a flawed hero. The press fixated on the contrast between Mother Thaw, the fierce matriarch, and Mrs. Holman, accused of selling her daughter. Meanwhile, Evelyn was drowning, hounded by reporters, scrutinized by the Thaws, and abandoned by all but May Mackenzie, the only friend who stood by her. Even Harry, from his cell, recognized her isolation, but did nothing to help. Financially, she remained at Mother Thaw's mercy. Jury selection was chaos. 600 men vetted before 12 were seated. The prosecution kept it simple. Did Harry kill White? Evelyn Riley remarked, "If this is the only question, the case will not last very long." The real issue was his sanity, momentary madness or deep-seated instability. While Mother Thaw spent a fortune on alienists to confirm temporary insanity, the press began exposing Harry's violent past. The defense floundered under the incompetent Gleason, who contradicted himself at every turn. Witnesses painted a damning picture. White's son recounted the murder, a fireman recalled Harry's confession, and the coroner revealed White had been gravely ill and unlikely to live much longer. As the defense unraveled, Delphine Delmas replaced Gleason, shifting to the unwritten law defense, Harry as Evelyn's avenger. Evelyn was horrified when Delmas informed her she would have to recount every painful detail of her past with White. He dismissed her hesitation. Your husband's life is in the balance. After all, what does it matter? The words chilled her. If Harry was convicted, she would have nothing. His acquittal was her only means of survival. On February 7, 1907, Evelyn took the stand as a packed courtroom held its breath. Dressed demurely, she looked almost childlike as she relived her painful past. Delmas wasted no time. She was forced to recount White's betrayal in harrowing detail. Harry crumbled, jurors wept, and the courtroom sat spellbound as she became the spectacle. The next day, an even larger crowd swarmed the courthouse. Delmas read Harry's obsessive love letters aloud, revealing his hatred of White and desperate need to possess Evelyn. Outside, frenzied onlookers mobbed her, police struggling to contain the hysteria. Jerome's cross-examination was ruthless. He prodded into her modeling past, hoping for scandal, but when the infamous bearskin rug photos proved tame, he sneered in frustration. Years of Harry's interrogations had hardened Evelyn. She pushed back, earning rare courtroom sympathy. But then Jerome found her weakness. Le Rat Mort, a notorious Parisian cafe. Catching her hesitation, he accused her of deception. Overwhelmed, she finally cracked. In a shocking moment, she admitted, outside that one awful thing, he had been very kind to me. The Thaws were horrified. Though her words rattled the defense, Jerome's aggression backfired. Public sympathy shifted toward Evelyn. After 3 days, she returned to the stand, facing more attacks on her finances and ties to White. When asked if she had received money from White after reconciling with Harry, she hesitated before lying, never in any way, shape, or manner. After 47 hours of deliberation, the jury deadlocked. A furious Harry awaited retrial. In 1908, his defense pivoted to temporary insanity, forcing Evelyn to endure humiliation again. On February 1st, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity and sent to Matawan Asylum. His mother seized control of the family fortune, and Evelyn was left with nothing. At first, Evelyn pitied Harry, visiting him in his comfortable suite, but his erratic moods and growing resentment soured any sympathy. While women sent him fan letters, the Thaws cut off her financial support. She turned to sculpting, but remained consumed by hatred for Harry, mirroring his for her. For years, she testified against his release, warning he was still dangerous. To save his life, they proved him mad, she wrote. Now, to keep him locked up, they lash him into fury. Though she and Harry never reunited, their names remained linked. He paid her a modest allowance and was rumored to have bought her an Atlantic City bungalow. When he died in 1947, he left her $10,000, the same sum bequeathed to a Virginia waitress. In 1910, pregnant and desperate after Harry denied paternity of her son Russell, Evelyn fled to Germany. Penniless, she reconciled with her mother, who cared for Russell while she sought work. A year later, she sailed to London, where theater manager Albert de Courville offered her a stage role. Though reluctant to exploit her notoriety, she had no choice. British tabloids attacked her hiring, and Harry's public rejection of Russell only fueled the scandal. Seeking refuge, she fled to Paris. A sympathetic journalist helped soften her image, and de Courville arranged for her to train with dancer Jack Clifford for her London debut in Hullo, Ragtime. Producers planned to disguise her among the chorus, but by opening night the controversy had faded. To test her nerves, they slipped her into an earlier performance. Panic nearly overtook her until she recalled her Florodora ritual. Drawing on muscle memory, she steadied herself, took a breath, and stepped back into the spotlight. In 1914, she transitioned to silent films, appearing in Threads of Destiny, Redemption, and The Woman Who Gave, often alongside Russell, who later became an accomplished pilot. Her brief marriage to Clifford, her dance partner, ended in 1918 when he tired of being known only as Mr. Evelyn Nesbit. After years of legal battles, their divorce was finalized in 1933. The 1920s and 30s saw her spiral into addiction, suicide attempts, and financial instability. She performed in vaudeville, cabarets, and even burlesque, joking at 55, "I wish I were a stripteaser. I wouldn't have to bother with so many clothes." She opened short-lived nightclubs, including Chez Evelyn and the Evelyn Nesbit Club, but none brought stability. In 1925, after a 6-week run in Chicago, she attempted suicide by swallowing disinfectant. Doctors later credited the gin in her stomach for saving her life. Tragedy struck Evelyn once again in 1928 when her brother Howard took his own life at the age of 42. He had always blamed her for the murder of Stanford White, whom he had loved as a father, and by the time of his death, the two hadn't seen or spoken to each other in years. In her later years, Evelyn sought solace in sculpting, studying at the Grant Beach School of Arts and Crafts in Los Angeles, where she later taught ceramics. In 1954, she resurfaced as a consultant for The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing, a Hollywood dramatization of her life, earning another $10,000. While working on the film, she collapsed from exhaustion, later suffering a stroke in 1956. Evelyn published 2 memoirs, The Story of My Life, 1914, and Prodigal Days, 1934, but she never fully escaped the scandal that defined her youth. Decades later, reflecting on her fate and the struggles she had endured since that disastrous night in 1906, Evelyn admitted, "Stanny White was killed, but my fate was worse. I lived." On January 17, 1967, Evelyn Nesbit died in a Santa Monica nursing home at 82, after spending her final years in quiet obscurity. She was buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California, an enigmatic figure to the end, forever the girl in the red velvet swing. So, what do you think of Evelyn Nesbit's tragic and scandal-filled life? Was she a victim of her era, or did she manage to carve out her own legacy despite the chaos? And what are your thoughts on Stanford White and Harry Thaw? Villains, products of their time, or something more complicated? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, keep seeking the stories that move your soul.